welcome to this edition of the Eric Miscoll Show. I'm Eric Miscoll with EMS Now. Thank you for joining us today. As always, we have Phil Stoten joining us from Down Under. Welcome, Phil. Our topic today is the military defense electronics sector of the electronics manufacturing services industry. To help us in our discussion today, we have invited two guests. Joining us is Lauren Nickle, Senior Vice President, Aerospace and Defense at Benchmark Electronics, and also Mike McCormack, President and CEO of CP Technologies. Welcome both of you, and thank you for joining us today for our conversation. Always like to begin with introductions, so I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and your companies for the benefit of our audience. And Lauren, why don't we begin with you?
Thanks for inviting Benchmark to join the discussion. So I have the privilege of leading our aerospace and defense business. So Benchmark is a contract manufacturing. We do manufacturing and engineering services around the globe. Our aerospace and defense business, a bit more heavy on the defense side, with a big, pretty extensive U.S. footprint, both in manufacturing capabilities and engineering.
Okay, wonderful. And Mike?
Yeah, I'm Mike McCormack. I'm the President and CEO of CP North America. CP is a design and manufacturer of rugged and survivable computer hardware, data communications, and unmanned aerial vehicles to the defense and civil markets. We've been around as a company for probably more than 25 years now, and see it, predominantly 80 to 90% of our business is defense related.
Mill and aero are they're always combined, but I always think of them as different still too, right? Because if we look at over the last few years, especially like commercial aircraft, it's been that's been a hard pressed industry. Whereas, the defense side, the military side still continues apace, right? So I guess my question is how would you, and maybe Lauren, start with you here, how do you categorize a sector and what's under your purview, and how do you, because I guess part of that becomes how involved you can become in the manufacturing process as well.
So that's a great question, Eric. I appreciate it. We think about our business a bit two-dimensional, I would say. We first think about it in terms of product types and the kinds of technologies that Benchmark needs to have to support our customer base. And so there's a variety of what we call subsectors that we develop pedigree and experience and capability supporting our customers. So a subsector is displays and sensors. Another is navigation, RF communications, data encryption and transmission, and then mechanical and digital subsystems. And, while we focus on it from a product standpoint and a technology, we also then, from a matrix standpoint, think about how we leverage this experience and capabilities across a range of platforms. So you can have pedigree and experience in the displays area, but it goes across a variety of platforms. So manned, unmanned aviation, maritime, ground-based systems, dismounted soldiers, satellites, it goes across a gamut of things. So when we think about our market and the ways that we support customers, it's both with this product technology dimension and then this platform dimension, because the requirements for ruggedization or environmental conditions certainly differ by application and platform that we're thinking about it. So we're thinking about it a little bit more like a matrix, if that answers your question.
No, it does. Thank you for that. Mike, how do you view it from your perspective?
Well, not a lot different than how Lauren is expressing as well. Ours is a little bit different in the sense that, so CP North America has three business units. One is CP Technology that focuses on the rugged computer hardware that we design and manufacture. And then we segment that down into departments within the DoD, whether it be the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, et cetera. Because like Lauren points out, when you look at ruggedization, especially in computer hardware, the Navy has specific requirements that are different from the Army, different from the Air Force, et cetera. So when you're looking at that, again, that matrix side of it, of how you leverage different technologies to different branches is fundamental to the success of our business. Then we have our CP Aero business, which is our unmanned aerial vehicle side of our business, which then takes some of the computer hardware from the ground control stations, the communications to be able to fly the unmanned aircraft. And that side is totally different because now you have the FAA certifications, you have different maintenance requirements because you're not just selling a product, you're operating the product as well, and even possibly leasing the product. So you have a totally different supply chain. You have a totally different operational characteristics as a business unit that you have to be prepared for. And so a lot of differentiation, but a lot of crossover between the two. And then our smaller portion of our business is CP Systems, which we supply, believe it or not, people like Major League Baseball, bioscience companies, Omron Robotics, with very specialized computer systems that they can't get from the HPs and the Dells of the world.
Okay, so they're buying from your sector because they have a specific technology need, not because it's a defense or aero requirement.
Yes, specifically in the commercial marketplace, yeah, it's down to they need FCC requirements. There may be medical application requirements, and and I'm sure Lauren understands this as well. A lot of people will understand that you can't go to a Dell or HP and say, hey, I need 1,000 of these, and they all have to be FCC qualified, because Dell will go, hey, we don't tool them for less than 100,000 pieces, so go away. Yeah. So that's where companies like us, in that specialized computing environment come into play.
How much of the work that you're doing is for domestic customers versus a foreign market? Lauren, how is it at Benchmark?
Yeah, I mean, so we're very heavily weighted on the domestic front. So, upwards of 70% of our business is more so on the defense side. Although, depending on the application, there's a tenet that I think is pretty important, as Mike was alluding to earlier. The lines between technologies that we're using in military applications and things that are in the commercial space, I mean, they're evolving. Things are the lines are blurring, I would say.
No, most definitely.
And it's not to say that things fit into this nice compartmentalized box that, these are parts we use only for military applications, right? More commercial off the shelf products are being used. That's certainly part of long-term strategies that, many of our DoD entities have been on this journey for some time. So, I actually think it's just going to continue to perpetuate this blurring of what's defense and what's commercial.
Yeah,
and I would agree with Lauren, and that's the challenge it brings to the supply chain, because it used to be that the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the GDs all built their own, from our perspective, built their own computer hardware. Yeah. And then, when the after 9/11, the Afghan war and Iraq, there was a demand for, very rapid deployment of systems. And the GDs and Lockheeds were always based upon, we got 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years to deliver this, this weapons platform. And that just wasn't acceptable, especially in special operations, et cetera. So, the drive to go to commercial off the shelf, lower cost, faster deployment times became essential. But at the same time, the problem in the US supply chain was, hey, let's go to Asia and buy cheap product. And let's all, rush off to offshoring all of our manufacturing for technology. And that started back in the 60s with Japan and the move to Asia. But the problem now is that we have adversaries in the Asian marketplaces. And I always use the analogy that I always throw to people. I said, buying from China is the equivalent of the United States buying all its weapons from the Russians during the Cold War. I said, you're basically funding the growth of an economic and military adversary. And so that has now put this huge pressure, and I'm sure Lauren sees it as well, as, hey, how do we onshore now? How do we bring everything back and reduce that dependency, especially in processing, memory, et cetera, dependency on Asian sources of supply that are coming. Maybe the component itself doesn't come from China, but the subcomponents do. And that's the problem we have with Taiwan today, is that they're under huge geopolitical pressure from China. And
that's why I think it's so exciting to see us make, an investment in, as a country, in, capacity here in the US in the semiconductor space. When you look at the announcements, I mean, Samsung has certainly continued to make investments in Austin, Global Foundries in Malta, New York, and now you see the recent examples of Intel investing in Arizona and TSMC. I mean, this is need to continue to be at the forefront of our thought in terms of, you know, agendas that are important for our country long term, to see this kind of capacity for components being manufactured in the US. It's certainly, I think, of strategic importance as we think about our broader supply chain and stability of that. So very, very excited about that.
And I'll blow the horn for the marketing horn for Benchmark here. You know, we're already talking to Benchmark saying, hey, how can you manufacture things for us so we don't have to go offshore? And we need to find partners. You know, we're trying to find partners. You know, we moved our manufacturing from California to Arizona this year. And what's important to us is having a supply chain, because we're doing everything from chassis, power supplies, fans, motherboards, and we need sources of supply in the US. And first of all, everybody sees the effects of COVID and the backup of the ports. You know, you have ships that used to take a week to unload are now taking 6 weeks to unload. So we just can't live in that world. And so I think this is going to push huge pressure on not just the defense market, but also into the consumer market, industrial markets as well, to bring onshoring back into the US again, you know, to bring that core manufacturing. But there's other challenges there to bringing all that manufacturing to the US again. You know, there's huge challenges there.
Yeah, you know, it's fascinating what you're saying, and you kind of hit straight on the elephant in the room, which is the, you know, supply chain shortages, issues and challenges around there, and the big trend towards you know, towards reshoring stuff from Asia, where you know, so much business went. What I'm curious about, and from a Benchmark point of view, you're a global manufacturing company. You're going to be seeing this trend in every sector, probably more in defense and aero than other sectors. How do you manage it from your own capacity? Are you ramping capacity in North America to deal with that? Are you withdrawing from capacity elsewhere? How do you see it from a global footprint point of view?
So we have been making strategic investments in capacity in the US in the last several years. I think we'll continue to make strategic investments in the US. I think the elephant in the room for Benchmark specifically, I think, is less about our capacity. It's more around the supply chain. And getting parts. And I do feel like, you know, we're in this crisis, what feels like at a moment in time like a crisis, but the reality is, you know, we have very experienced teams, and, you know, they've faced significant challenges in the past. COVID was a challenge, and, you know, we've had you know, cyber incidences. I mean, our team has really risen to the challenge time and time again. When up against the wall, how do they respond? So, you know, we're really trying to shift from this reactive mode to a far more proactive mode with all of our customers. Before they're even asking us, we're driving the conversation around, let's look at your next 24 months of demand and how do we reduce risk for you? And it's a financial decision for them and for us on how much risk can you tolerate in your business. And there's maybe areas that you can tolerate risk, and there's areas that you can't tolerate risk. So we really need to have, you know, the difficult conversation and be very proactive and kind of confront this elephant in the room. It's our responsibility to have that conversation with our customers, and we've got the, you know, the know-how and the experience to at least put options on the table. It would be crazy to not to.
And it's this huge pendulum swing, and I can see Mike nodding throughout that discussion. But it's this huge pendulum swing from just in time to just in case. You know, we're changing that whole approach, but it has a huge impact on the manufacturing industry. It's absorbing cash, it's increasing inventory, it's increasing work in progress. So you do have to have very strong partnerships. And when I talk to EMS companies, particularly in the commercial area, where, you know, maybe those are the OEMs that will move around quite often, those relationships are really under pressure at the moment. How do you deal with that, Mike? How do you make sure that you have those trusted partners like Benchmark that you can literally say, you know, this is where we see things going in the next 24 months. We know disruptions are coming. You've got to be ready for anything. And how do you make that partnership work?
It was a huge paradigm shift for us because, you know, we looked at global supply chain, you know, over the last, you know, I've been with the company 7 years, and, you know, the first thing when I came to the company is, okay, how do we diversify supply to assure that we have continuity of supply for our customers? And, you know, our lead times were typically, you know, from the moment of an order to shipment was anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. And that was considered, you know, what I'd say very competitive in the marketplace. But now all of a sudden we have suppliers that are coming to us and saying, you know, who are supplying subcomponents to us are saying, hey, we're talking 4 to 6 months. So as Lauren says, you know, it's that elephant in the room. So now what you have to do is you have to proactively go engage your customers and say to them, hey, you know, you read the news, we're acutely aware of what's going on in the global market. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. We need to protect your supply chain. We need to check, and to be able to do that, we have to flow that downhill. So a lot of things of what we're starting to work with, some people want, you know, more of a Kanban relationship. Hey, hold inventory for us. We will pay for customer inventory to maintain our supply chain. And it means, like you said, it wraps up cash. It wraps up more, you know, with inventory. You know, you got more inventory stockpiling, and which, you know, obviously, you know, affects your cash flow. So as a manufacturer, you have to engage with your customers and be realistic, because, you know, I always say we put our customers first, and we don't do that just because, you know, it's a marketing message. It's really about how do we make sure that we don't let their supply chain down. You do not want to be on a defense program, especially some of our programs last 3 to 5 years. And what they don't want to hear is, I'm sorry, you know, I forgot to tell you that, you know, there's shortages of boards, you know, coming out of Asia now, we can't give them to you. You never want to have that conversation. What you want to do is have that proactive conversation. And it's, you know, again, like Lauren said, you go out there and say, hey, what is your outlook in the next 24 months? What's, you know, and in the defense market, sometimes they can't tell you that because they don't even know if they have funding past this 12 months. So you have, a lot of it is a very high risk, because you have to sit there and say, okay, I know you have visibility for next 12 months, but I know you can't tell me if next year it's funded, but what is your outlook if it is funded? And then you have to make the decision whether you're going to take that risk, you know, with your finance people, and sit down and look at that. And then obviously you're going into your investors, your bankers, and everybody, and talking about, hey, this is the reality of the world we now live in.
Yeah, so you're redesigning everything for disruption, aren't you? It's now a world where we're not just thinking, okay, well, you know, we don't know what the next crisis is. We're assuming there's going to be another disruption, because we had, yeah, well, we had you know, we've got the supply chain disruption this year. Last year, the big thing was pandemic. The big thing before that was trade wars. As you say, there's geopolitical unrest in the world. So, you know, there is disrupted seems to be the permanent state now.
Yeah.
And I think it's, yeah, and I would say, and I'm sorry to cut across you, Lauren, I'd sit there and say that is part of what you have to do to run a company these days if you want to be successful. You have to plan, almost, I would say, is the mindset of planning for what is the next thing that could hit us. You know, it's that whole environmental analysis of, okay, what's going on in the world? Will China try to intervene in Taiwan? You know, what's going to happen to Asian supply chains? You know, you have all of these geopolitical situations that are affecting it on top of COVID. And then, you know, if you're in the defense industry, and I'm sure Lauren again sees this every day, is what about the funding? You know, we have continuing resolutions. We don't know if all the funding is going to take place. And that again, there's a huge amount of risk there.
I couldn't agree more. And I think having, you know, spending as much time with your customers as you are with your suppliers, and understanding what are some options for you, and what do you do if, you know, so many things are not cancelable or returnable at this point in time, but are there brokers and distributors that you can work with, that if you don't need the parts, you can, you know, sell them to them so that they can funnel them back into the market. I mean, I think there's so many options, but, you know, quite frankly, I mean, the pendulum probably had swung too much to the just in time. I think very back to the very beginning of my career, I used to be in the chemical industry, and I was in the sulfuric acid industry, we used to say the person with the most rail cars wins, because it was always contingency planning. Rail cars equated to excess storage, so that if a refinery went down or a chemical plant blew up or something horrible, you had mobile storage. And so we always used to joke in that industry, the person with the most rail cars wins, because it was so much about risk reduction. And so in some ways, I think this is long overdue that we're starting to have some of these risk discussions about our business. I do think it'll eventually maybe come back and settle back to somewhere in the middle, but it's probably also healthy for us to start having some of these broader supply chain design discussions around supply chain.
Yeah.
And I would agree, because I think the expectation of the end user was not realistic. It's like, we want it and we want it now, and it's goes back to I want a pony. Well, I'm sorry, you can't have a pony. And
you want a pony, I want rail cars. We're good.
Yes, you want rail cars, they want a pony. But yeah, it comes back to that. There was, the just-in-time has now created unrealistic expectations in the market. Well, I used to have it. Why can't I have it now? Well, read the paper, see what's going on, see how long it takes to dock a ship, and you'll start understanding this, and then start understanding component shortages, semiconductor. And as Lauren said, I'm, especially in being in Arizona, seeing the amount of inward investment from the semiconductor industry, and then all the surrounding businesses that have to support that, from sheet metal vendors, other fabrication companies doing board fabrications, etc. That's good news for us, because it means that, I'm an honest believer that the DoD needs to focus on U.S. supply sources and U.S. Supply chains, and stop pushing it overseas. I always used to get upset when I would go on Navy ships and I'd see a whole rack of servers, and no disrespect to Dell, but when they say all made in China, I'm like, I can't believe you would have this high of a risk factor on your Navy ships. And, a lot of them didn't have a choice, because they were driven to, I need rapid delivery at the lowest possible cost. And that's all that mattered to them. And I think we're seeing that paradigm shift now.
Yeah, there are two players in that shift, though, aren't there? There's industry and there's government. And I'd ask the two questions: are they doing enough? Starting with industry, is the semiconductor industry doing enough to invest, because that's the bottleneck at the moment? Is it doing enough to invest in the Americas? And is the government doing enough to incentivize them? Lauren, what do you think? Take either one of those.
Well, I would say, it's exciting to see these investments. Understand and appreciate that this is not a light switch. This capacity won't come online.
Takes years.
It does take time. There's also insufficient, coming from the chemical industry, there's insufficient chemical capacity to supply the fabs that are going in the US. So there's all these ancillary industries that are multi-years away from major capital investments, that really, there's a whole infrastructure that needs to be built around it. So it's exciting to see. It does not provide an instant relief, but it's exciting to see we're at least headed down the right path.
Yeah.
And from a government perspective, you said, is the government doing enough? I think, right now the government is about paying lip service to it, because people are seeing the effects. So, government has to respond and say, yeah, hey, we're really doing a lot. But, for the government to do something, you really need, you look at what happens in wartime. The one thing the United States has always been great at is, in wartime, we can gear up rapidly and take all the resources we have, natural resources, manufacturing, technology, and we can rapidly gear up to totally changes our supply chain. And I think right now the United States needs, I'm not saying create a wartime footing, but create a momentum, the same thing like that on a smaller scale, to get our supply chain really geared up. And it goes back to core fundamentals of even like education. I was having this conversation a week ago, and it's like, hey, we told everybody you had to go to university instead of going to trade school. So we don't even have the capacity of people who are experts in, the journeyman manufacturing expertise. We don't have that base like we used to have, because we told everybody, hey, go get a liberal arts degree, or go, be a lawyer, whatever. And we did away with our trade, our crafts people. We did away with them. And it was sad to see because, you know, my generation, you know, I still had vocational schools. I had the choice between a trade school and that. And that's what hurts in the manufacturing, because you need those 2 years degree that teaches automation, robotics, simple, you know, and the crafts journeymen who can manufacture products that we used to be so good at doing that we gave away to, you know, to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and it seems that now's the ideal time because there's money swashing around. You know, there's government incentive money, and for me the challenge is how do they direct it? How do they direct it towards automation, towards digital transformation, towards upskilling the workforce, to make sure when that supply chain that Lauren talks about being in place in 2 or 3 years' time, because it does take that long, making sure there are enough people to skill that, enough talent, because certainly when you look at Asian competitors, the number of people coming out of their universities is just massively higher.
Indeed.
Yeah, most definitely. But, you know, the same thing, they geared up towards manufacturing in the 90s. You know, I was running factories in Europe. And at the time I was working for Emerson, and we bought Ericsson's energy business. And the first thing they did is they took it out of Sweden and they moved it to China. And, you know, and that was, you know, in the mid 90s. And there was this huge push to take everything to China and, you know, Eastern Europe, you know, always looking for the lowest common manufacturing dollar. And I think now we've hit a brick wall because, you know, the problem that you have is when you create that, like we have in China, you create a middle class. You create a middle class, they demand more, you know, better living conditions, better housing, cars. They want everything else that they've been supplying the rest of the world. And now we have this great economic power growing out of China. And then we're sitting there wondering why they own all our debt and they own all our manufacturing. And I think that is, you know, I just don't want to beat up on China here, but I think it's our fault as a country. And I think it's the same thing with a lot of Western nations. We were just looking for how do we get the cheapest TVs built and the cheapest cars and the cheapest electronics that we could get our hands on. And unfortunately, supply and demand drove that, even in the defense industry.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Mike, that we're paying the price right now for chasing low-cost labor around the world. It's as simple as that. That's what we've done, and it's becoming a less important.
Let me come back to some of the material supply chain challenges there, because when I think about it, especially the military defense side, I think about the challenge of obsolescence, right? The end of life and what's handled there. You know, that hasn't gone away. You know, has that gotten worse during these times? You know, Lauren, you're kind of shaking your head. How's that these days?
That's forever the Achilles heel of our industry, and how you support, you know, aircraft and vehicles for over 40 years. It's, you know, I'm not sure I would say it's necessary. It's always been a challenge, and the business case for, you know, buying, you know, parts and carrying them and storing them for, you know, decades on end versus periodic, you know, redesigns and refreshes of your products. There's always a business case that has to be had. So I would say I'm not sure it's fundamentally changed in this environment. I think one of the things that we have kind of a burning platform to go ask our customers, please start looking at alternative sourcing, alternative parts, and starting to qualify alternative parts. And let's be far more proactive in that area. And it's maybe less for obsolescence and more for availability, but you know, that's often the last thing they want to put, you know, our customers want to put engineers on. There's not always a lot of glamour in the redesigns, and which is why Benchmark does offer these services as well. So if they want their best and brightest engineers working on next generation products, then we offer, you know, obsolescence redesign services as well, so that we can help, you know, augment their teams and do it faster. So obsolescence has always been a challenge. I'm not sure that's that's ever going to go away for us.
Very good. Yeah. And Mike,
it's the same from us. You know, just kind of backing up what Lauren's saying is, you know, our computers, the reason they have to be bought from people like us is that the design can't change for 5 to 10 years. So you have to manage a supply chain where you may have to buy boards that are going to, you know, you have to understand roadmaps of board manufacturers, memory, solid state devices, power supplies, everything. Because when we're supplying the U.S. Navy, they want obsolescence management for up to 20 years. And I always tell people, I said, if you think you can manage the obsolescence of a computer in the next 20 years, then you have a crystal ball that nobody else has. Because look at the rapid change of technology that we've been going through just in the last 10 years. And when you look at computers, communications, and just technology in general, trying to manage obsolescence in a supply chain over a 10 to 20 year period is an enormous challenge. So, sometimes it means buying forward. You have to buy the material forward. But I think and I don't know if Lauren is seeing this as much as we're seeing it. I think a lot of our customers are starting to hit the realization that the incubation period in technology is so rapid now, and it's changing so fast. Keeping a Navy ship, as an example, with the same computers for 10 to 20 years is no longer a realistic expectation. It was in the 60s and 70s and, even into the early 80s. And then it just changed because technology just rapidly started escalating, especially in computers and communications. I just tell people, I said, look at what your phone, I used to fly in an aircraft in the Air Force that my phone has a larger processing capability than that whole aircraft did in 1989. So, it just tells you the leaps and bounds we're making. So that obsolescence challenge and maintaining what's called tech refreshes, technology refreshes, which they typically do every 2 to 4 years in a program, is an enormous challenge because you have to keep form, fit, and function. And that's kind of hard to do these days with so much rapid change in technology.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more, Mike.
Yeah.
That's why we always have great conversations. We're
Very
on the same
agreeable.
boat. We're all in the same boat.
You both mentioned it, and I always remember the rub. I used to work for a small prototype company, and we supported, a particular military OEM. And we always feared the phone call that would come that said, okay, stop. I mean, programs ended like that, right? And and you've both kind of alluded to that, but is that getting any better? Is that just as bad? I mean, and then you add the whole change of administration in a government. I don't know what impact that.
Yeah.
Things.
Go ahead,
with the
Lauren.
customers.
I would say, we get pretty decent visibility. I don't feel like there's, I would say, for some of the, large primes, we tend to get, 1 to 2 year out visibility, not a whole lot of surprises. I think with the change in the Biden administration, again, I would say probably even still not a whole lot of surprises that we've seen. If I would say if there's a disruptor in the kinds of customers we work with and the kind of change and how we respond to that, I would say there's whole new players getting into our market, a bunch of tech companies that were not in the defense industry, and they behave like tech companies do, where they're used to coming out with brand new products every 6 to 9 months. I mean, look at Microsoft and what they're doing with IVAS. I mean, these are folks who they think differently, they behave differently. They rely on companies like Mike's and ours, to kind of understand the rules of the road from a DoD perspective. But our customers' needs are different, and how they behave with, roadmaps and, hey, let's go with this design and now let's change it. This flexibility, they need partners who can be agile and flexible. And to me, that's even more of how we need to behave differently than a change in the administration.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Lauren?
It's a good
or
thing.
Is it both?
I mean, it's a necessary.
Taking the industry.
It's a necessary thing. I mean, our world is evolving. The line between defense and commercial is merging more and more. I think for innovation to continue, we need to figure out a way to partner with these kinds of folks who are really leading edge technologies. We need to find ways to take their technologies and bring it into the defense space and do so in a constructive manner. So I think for the US to remain competitive and be the world leader, we need to embrace this change.
Mike?
Yeah, I always sit there and say the companies that ignore their environment have what's called a dinosaur strategy. You look out the window, you see the comet coming, but you ignore that it's going to hit you. And you just hope that, hey, you know, I can just keep going without evolving. And as Lauren says, I think she was alluding to is that you have to constantly be evolving. You have to constantly be aware of your environment, your customers' demands. And if you don't, you're going to become extinct pretty quickly. And I can't mention, you know, the companies that we ruggedize for, but a lot of the companies that are out there who are building commercial servers will not tool up, like I said earlier, for smaller volumes. And the DoD marketplace is mostly about 100 here, maybe 1,000, you know, et cetera, you know, on a program for a couple of years. And no large server manufacturer is going to tool up for 1,000 or 5,000 or even 10,000 pieces. So they actually, and especially because it has to be ruggedized and it has to meet mill standards, 901D, 810Z, 461, et cetera. So they come to us and they said, hey, we want you to basically take our unit, gut it, and then ruggedize it and put our logo on it and ship it as our product. So we become their contract manufacturer, but we also become their warehouse, and we become their design authority for the technical refreshes on it as well. So a lot of that is, you know, we saw that there was a need in the Defense Department to have rapid delivery of commercial grade systems, but that could be in a survivable package. And so we chased that marketplace specifically for that. The issue with the defense industry, and I used to have to discuss this with private equity when I would work for a company that was private equity, and they go, we don't understand, why don't you sell the same amount of widgets every month? And I said, because the defense business is lumpy. It comes in chunks. It doesn't come every month. It comes in, hey, deliver, you know, 500 pieces this month. And then in 6 months, we might want another 500 pieces, depending upon funding. And, you know, the challenge we have right now, and you mentioned the change of government, you know, we're in continuous resolutions now. So the funding isn't guaranteed. So even though they come out and say, hey, we have a 700 and approximately 10 billion defense budget, that doesn't mean any of the programs are funded out of that. It just says that's what we're allocating. And when we get congressional approval, we'll release those funds. But that's now under a continuing resolution. And it's no different than we went under, you know, when we were in sequestration, you know, the reduction of defense spending, you know, we're going at some of that funding, you'll get a program and you won't know it's funded. And they're waiting and waiting and waiting for the money. And one day you can be doing the design work and 2 years later before you get the order. So it can be a long process sometimes, depending upon DoD funding, you know, the government that's in place, and, you know, technology changes that are occurring at the same time halfway through your design, you know, your prototyping.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's interesting because, you know, I'm learning lots here because I think of the defense industry as being nice and steady, and, you know, you've got predictability, you can see out into the future. You need as much or more agility than you do in other industries. Lauren, from a benchmark point of view, from a benchmark view, you've got to build agility and resilience in at the same time.
Indeed, and at a macro level across an entire business, you know, programs are going to take these lumps. So it may at a high level, a business unit level, might appear to be steady Eddie, but the devil's in the details, as Mike alluded to. And the volatility we see on a particular program, you know, it is so lumpy. But, you know, when Mike was making his comments earlier, I'd be remiss to talk about, you know, our world's changing so much. I mean, think about the drone industry. And I mean, that was a market that we didn't even know existed 10 years ago. And, you know, Mike's building drones, and I mean, everybody's in that space. And that's just, it's a creation of a whole new market and what it's going to mean for the defense industry long term, both from an offense and a defense standpoint in the electronic warfare directed energy space. You know, I think there's tons of exciting things that are on the horizon for the next 10 years. Is that none of that's necessarily fully envisioned in what does this mean in the budget yet? You know, these are creation of new markets.
Yeah, especially the drone industry. You know, we're building UAVs and people say, okay, what are they used for? And I say, imagine everything and anything. So to give you an idea, and I always say this as a joke, we were, you know, when we were looking at moving and we looked at Prescott, the people that own the land were actually ranchers. And he said, so what are your drones used for? And I said, we do surveying, we do, for the civil market. I know what they're doing for surveying. They're doing for, maritime patrol. They're doing for border patrol. They're doing for gas and oil pipeline inspection, power grid inspection, nuclear power stations, etc. And he goes, could you track cattle? And I go, what? And he goes, yeah, we got some really expensive head of Black Angus cattle and they have RFID readers. He goes, could you track them? He goes, because sometimes they wander off in the mountains and we can't find them. And I go, yeah, we actually have RFID readers on our drones and we can track cattle. He goes, great, I can do away with the cowboys. So, I was giving a little bit of the story and I'm just trying to shoot in my head. But
drone cowboy.
We've gone this, the military with unmanned aircraft is a very growing marketplace. And the reason being is it takes out manned aircraft. It takes out the threat of, the problems with manned aircraft. You hear about swarming. You hear about the Loyal Wingman program where you have a high-speed jet-powered UAV next to a fighter or a bomber providing protection. So all of this is evolving into, how wide and far do you want to think about this? You have unmanned subsurface vessels now. We're supplying computerized systems onto unmanned surface vessels for navigation and weapons control. So there is so many opportunities in the UAV market that cover not just the defense industry, but the civil industry as well. And again, it's crop spraying, it's surveying, power grids throughout the United States, oil pipelines, looking at leak detection in oil and gas fields. So the opportunities are unlimited in that marketplace.
Yeah. And Lauren, I guess that's one of those industries that has a whole bunch of players that are from the commercial market entering the defense market and vice versa. If one's a military application and another one's an unmanned cowboy chasing Black Angus cattle around a ranch.
Because so much of the hardware, design can be leveraged across a variety of different applications. Not everything needs to be a secure communication. Although, if I can figure out a way to get a drone to follow my teenagers around on a Saturday night, that would probably save me a whole lot of time.
Hey, Lauren, call me afterwards and I can have their phones intercepted as well, okay?
We'll edit that bit.
Hey, the one entity that wasn't mentioned in this, I'm thinking about the technology development that you're talking about. You're talking about others coming in. What about the government, what is it, DARPA and what have you? Is that driving a whole lot of this still, or is that coming from outside of that environment?
From our perspective, DARPA, the research and development side, is really the leading edge. And that's where, you talked about, having a small prototyping business. That's really what the DARPA's and the Naval Research, AvWorks, and different R&D, and a lot of the universities are involved in this. Georgia Tech, Johns Hopkins, Arizona State. There's a lot of Southwest Research Institute. A lot of these are incubators for the DoD. So a lot of what happens is, ideas are created there. The what ifs, what can we do? What is the art of the impossible or the art of the possible? And that's where they're the incubators that create the technology that gets spread around, and then eventually ends up in the program office level, whether it be NAVWAR, NAVC, NAVAIR, et cetera, or the program offices in the Army and the Air Force. They go there, to be trialed out as full weaponized, say a full-scale program, a weapons program. So a lot of those are important from a design and manufacture like us, trying to introduce new technology. That's the first place we go, aircraft and with some of our computer technology.
Yeah. And Lauren, from your perspective, for someone like Benchmark, at what point do you have your fingers in there kind of seeing what's happening? You do.
We do. We have a part of our business that we call our solutions business. So where we do have some, and again, it's not a large part of our business, but we make strategic investments and IP. We do work with DARPA, where we feel like having some experience and pedigree in, again, very targeted areas are something that ultimately are going to be value-added capabilities that our customers will want also more broadly. So, so we dabble in that. Again, it's a relatively small part of our business, but from a strategic standpoint, I think we also recognize the value of being on the cutting edge and understanding what's going on. I think it also helps us understand what are, how are our customers thinking about these things. So we're, it's only 9% of what we do is direct to the DoD. So we're often working through the primes, but I think it helps us understand things from their perspective as well.
Okay, good. Listen, I know we're running up against the clock here, so I just want to kind of wrap it and kind of get your crystal balls out and get an idea of kind of, as we look at this sector, what are the key trends that you think are going to have the biggest impact in over the next couple of years here? And I know we're got, budgets aside, from a technology side, what do you think are those key trends that we need to keep an eye on in this particular sector? Lauren, maybe I start with you.
I feel like we covered a lot of this, but I would say there's more cultural. I think there's more cultural change that we need to figure out. Maybe less so than anything. When we talked about agility and flexibility, I think that's something that we at Benchmark really focus on so much because technologies are converging. What is the book? The Future is Faster Than You Think, where it's a fascinating book, but it just helps you realize that the creations of new markets, the converging of technologies, things that we thought would happen 20, 30 years from now are now happening 2 to 3 years from now. It is our responsibility to figure out how to adapt, how to be flexible, how to listen, be agile, be transparent with our customers. And I just think that's a whole different skill set that is demanded of EMS companies now than more so than 10 years ago. So I think honestly, for us and our priorities are, how do we become more agile and be more, to be a good partner. I mean, we really need to be very transparent, very communicative, and flexible for our customers. So honestly, I mean, I would say we're more focused on some of the cultural elements to help enable.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of the business, isn't it? Having the right culture in place to be adaptable, to be flexible, to be resilient, and that's going to hold you in good stead regardless of what industry you're in.
I always like to be hopeful on a how can I say, and I would use Lauren's terminology as culture. I hope as the U.S. in our supply chain, we have a cultural shift from moving towards a service-based technology, a service-based economy, and just being an incubator to going back to being the creator of technology, the manufacturing of that technology, and going back to our core strengths. When you have dominance in your supply chain and your core capabilities, I think that's essential. So I hope to see a lot more onshoring. I hope to see more inward investment from people like Taiwan Semiconductor, Intel, and other manufacturing. I want to see. I would really like to see that because I think, from a perspective of our economy, to support of our war fighters and within the DoD, I think it's essential for us to gain back the control of our supply chain as much as possible. You're not going to eliminate it completely because there's always raw materials and sources of supply you need outside the United States. But the core competency, I hope we go back to our education system and educate people that manufacturing is a good career field, automation's a great area, and going back to the trade of having that competency to make sure that we have a robust supply chain to our DoD is essential. Because the reason for our Department of Defense, it's there to fight wars. And if you're not prepared to fight a war, then you're wasting your time. And I think we've run into that as a country a few times, and I think we saw that in the ramp up in Iraq and Afghanistan of how supply chain and change of technology can be so instrumental in affecting your ability to fight wars and defend yourself.
Yeah, constant disruption, keep an eye on all that geopolitical stuff. The US has got a great opportunity. It's got the biggest consumer market in the world. It's got great innovation footprint. We just need to fix up that supply chain and get more talent into manufacturing. And I think that would make all the difference.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Thank you very much, Mike and Lauren. This has been excellent. I've enjoyed this. You've educated us. I'm sure the viewers are appreciating it. This has been very good. I appreciate your time today. For the audience, if you're interested in what these people are doing, please reach out to them. You can certainly find them in LinkedIn. If you can't find them there, get a hold of me and I'll do my best to put you in touch with them.
Can we thank you as well? I think the work that you guys do is so important, and the series of webinars that you're having, in a world when so many of us have been locked up in home offices and unable to travel, vehicles like, your webinar sessions, I think are just really important, opportunities for learning and getting folks to understand what's going on out there. So, we really also very much appreciate the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Keep it
Yeah,
up.
most definitely. I'll second Lauren and also say, Lauren, I'm looking forward to coming down and seeing you and Mike and discussing and how we can collaborate together and how you guys can support us as well. So,
outstanding. We welcome
Excellent.
it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much
Again,
for having me. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you for the nice comments and a successful end to the year, and happy holidays to you all.